Good morning. I want to start with a word to fathers because it is Father's Day. The message this morning is not going to be specifically about fathers, but I'm reading a book right now by Eric Metaxas, and it's called 7 Men and the Secret to Their Greatness. And Eric is a Christian scholar, and he chronicles 7 men who are essentially heroes in history. And he's trying to provide for young men something that the media and national television is trying to totally root out, which is the idea of a strong, good man, a hero, and what all is involved in that. And he says this. I want to read just a brief excerpt. And again, this is not going to have anything particularly to do with this morning, but I wanted to start it. I was reading this yesterday, and in this section called What is Real Manhood, he says, since the father has traditionally been seen as the leader of the family, it only follows that if we've taken the very idea of authority down, which we have in Western society, that is one of the goals, by the way. If you look around, pay attention to Western society. The concept of authority is being totally broken down. Let's get rid of the police. That president is not my president. The idea of authority is being taken down all around. Now, if we take it out altogether, what's going to happen to fatherhood? Fatherhood is going to lose essentially what was there at the beginning. But he says, if we've taken down the very idea of authority down, we've taken fatherhood down with it. Can anyone doubt that the idea of fatherhood has declined dramatically in the last 40 or so years? One of the most popular TV shows of the 1950s was called Father Knows Best. Wonder if anyone in here remembers that. I don't remember it, but I'm going to go look at it now. It was a sweet portrayal of a wonderful and in many ways typical American family. The father, played by Robert Young, was the unquestioned authority, but his authority was never harsh or domineering. His strength was a quiet strength. In fact, he was gentle and wise and kind and giving, so much so that just about everyone watching the show wished their dad could be more like that. But of course, today we tend to see fathers depicted in the mainstream media as either dunces or as overbearing fools. Can you argue that? That's the picture that's painted. It's not a true picture. Doesn't mean that there aren't bad fathers in the world, but that is not a depiction of what fatherhood is in an ideal world, and it is not a depiction of what most fathers are. Fathers are to be honored. I saw the other day, my sister posted a picture. It was an advertisement. Facebook, Taylor makes advertisements to you based on who you are. The other day, I saw an advertisement for a shirt that said, just a Minnesota guy living in an Oklahoma world. And I thought, oh my goodness, Facebook knows way too much about me. If you only would understand the joke if you knew I was from Minnesota. And by the way, I'm from Minnesota, but I wouldn't classify myself as a Minnesota guy. So it was just a Minnesota guy living in an Oklahoma world. So they tailor make the advertisements to you. But my sister saw this advertisement by Simple Human. They make household items, trash cans and stuff for putting around your house. And the advertisement was a man standing at the sink washing the dishes. A mother was standing off to the side with her boy that she was playing with. And right next to the father was a brand new dish rack, real sleek, modern, very nice looking, attractive piece. Never seen a dish rack that I thought looked really awesome. I was like, whoa, that's a sweet looking dish rack. It was the coolest dish rack I've ever seen. But this is what the little advertisement said. For this Father's Day, how about you get him something and pretend like he actually deserves it? That made me angry. You cannot say a thing against mothers, the society we live in, but you can slam fathers. That isn't right. And we need to keep the idea of biblical manhood going, representing what it is and what it means. And I praise God for the many good fathers that are in this building this morning. And I encourage the young men who are going to be fathers one day to be the same. Now let's go ahead and get started with the message in Romans. Having spent 4 weeks on the first 7 verses of Romans chapter 1, this morning we're going to spend 1 week looking at Romans 1, 8 through 15. I want to read this. First of all, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you because your faith is proclaimed in all the world. For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I mention you always in my prayers, asking that somehow by God's will I may now at last succeed in coming to you, for I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to strengthen you. That is, that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. I don't want you to be unaware, brothers, that I've often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some harvest among you as well as among the rest of the Gentiles. I am under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. So I'm eager to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome. There are basically 2 ideas that I want to expose in the text this morning. Namely, number 1, what is the element of a faith that becomes so well known that it is the centerpiece of conversation all the way around the world? And number 2, what is the substance of divinely authorized missions? Those are 2 things that I think Paul gets at in this section, and I want to expose them for what they are. First one, I've been reading through Romans a lot, and we've been in Romans now for 5 weeks. And so I'm always thinking ahead of questions that I have that I don't yet know the answers to, and I just read and keep reading. And if a question, by the way, if you're reading the Bible and you have a question, just keep reading. It's either answered right there in the context or it'll be answered somewhere else. That's how the Bible works. But I've been having this question, and I didn't get to the bottom of it until this week, because the question was this. When I was reading this text for the first time, Romans chapter 1, verse 8, something that he said there stood off the page. It just kind of leapt off the page at me. Because he said, I thank my God because your faith is proclaimed in all the world. Now, he does not say, I thank my God because the faith is proclaimed in all the world, which would be a way of saying, I thank God that the gospel is being preached everywhere, which would also be true. That's just not the point that he's saying right here. He's specifically calling attention to the faith of the collective body of Roman Christians there in Rome. And he's saying, I thank my God because of your faith, because your faith is proclaimed everywhere in the world. The first thing when I read that, I underlined that statement, and I drew an arrow to the top of my piece of paper that I was doing my notes on, and I just wrote, I want to be a church like that. And I moved on because I didn't really know exactly what would be involved in that and what that exactly means. But isn't that a good question? What happened to make the Roman church a church that the faith of the Christians was a centerpiece of conversation all the way around the ancient world? This is before the age of internet, which makes it even that much more amazing. It's not like they were doing podcasts and people over in Syria were listening to the Roman Christian podcast. They didn't have internet. So the fact that a body of Christians could have their faith so well known, so solid, that people all around the world were talking about the faith of the Christians in Rome, what is that? I mean, don't you want to know the answer to that? So anyways, I was asking the question. And by the way, this is not just a point of rhetoric, like trying to build false esteem before he really lays out some heavy theology on these Christians. I've seen it before where, a guest speaker will come, or, somebody that doesn't know the group at all. He'll say something like, now I can tell y'all are a smart bunch of people. Well, he doesn't know that. That's just false building up. It's intended to get people feeling good about themselves so that they'll listen to whatever it is he's going to say. Paul is not given false rhetoric here. And here's why I say that. The only reason that Paul knows about the faith of the Roman church is because he had been testified and told about it from other people. Paul's never been to Rome. This is not one of the many churches that Paul had reached on one of his missionary journeys. He doesn't know these people. All right? So the fact alone that Paul is speaking of their faith and some particulars of it, having not been there, is a testimony to the truth of what he's saying, that your faith is proclaimed all around the world. You go to chapter 15 and verse 20. He says, I make it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named. If I'm going to go preach the gospel, I'm not going to go where there's already a church there. This is Paul. Lest I build on someone else's foundation. But as it is written, those who have never been told of him will see, and those who have never heard will understand. This is the reason why I have so often been hindered from coming to you. The church there in Rome had already been established, and in the ideology of Paul, I'm not going to go. There are too many places in the world that don't have the church yet, so I'm not going to go to the place that already has a church, lest I build on somebody else's foundation. That's the reason why I've not come to you yet, he says. Okay? Now, he keeps going. He says, but now, as he's penning this, getting toward the end of this letter, but now, since I no longer have any room for work in these regions that don't know the gospel yet, and since I have longed for many years to come to you, I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain. So he doesn't know these Christians. And he wants to go. What is it about them that made Paul know and that made the rest of the world know of their faith? I want to be a church like that. I don't just mean that in a silly passing way. I want the Kingfisher Church to be known around the world for its faith. And so, as I'm thinking through the question, how does that happen? Not knowing the answer, because I don't think Paul expressly answers it between verses 8 and 15 of chapter 1, so you just keep reading in the book. I came across something in chapter 16 that I thought was illuminating in this regard. Chapter 16, go to verse 19. Now, I'll tell you a little bit of the context. Before he says what he's about to say, he's giving his parting words, and he's making a final warning to the Roman Christians to look out for those who cause dissensions and stir up strife and who are promoting something contrary to the doctrine that they had always known. Look out for these people that are going to divide you and that are going to bring in some insidious false doctrine. And then he says, because your obedience is known to all. So the connection is, don't let somebody come in and mess that up. Because your obedience is known to all, so that I rejoice over you. Now, you go back to chapter 1. I thank my God because your faith is proclaimed in all the world. Then in chapter 16, your obedience is known to all, so I rejoice, or I give thanks. So the connection is unmistakable. He's saying the same thing in two different ways, and it ties in very closely to the heart of the theme and the purpose of this book, which was, if you remember back 5 weeks ago, the purpose of the book of Romans is to bring about the obedience of faith in all nations, so as to present them to God as acceptable sacrifices. Chapter 1, Paul says, I was given my grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith. Chapter 16, right as he's leaving, Is he's writing, I mean, the last words, he says that God worked the gospel and all of it to bring about the obedience of faith. Now, one of the things that I stressed for the first 2 weeks was that it is an obedience born out of faith. Now, here's the thing. If you have a true, fundamental, real, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Rock solid, but that's not the word, but that'll do. Solid, robust. There we go. A robust faith in the gospel of God. And that's where your heart is. Obedience always comes out of that. Always. If you get the cart before the horse and you start trying to obey without properly believing, the obedience is marginal, utterly unimpressive, and will fail in nearly every regard. Paul draws out what it was that made these Christians so known. Their obedience to the gospel of God. And that came from a faith that was so deeply and profoundly rooted in God that God said it, I believe it. God says, do it, I'm going to do it. Doesn't mean you don't investigate to understand and know and come to believe and have a solid faith in the Bible as it is. That's one thing I've done. That's why I feel so compelled to stand on top of it and say whatever has to be said, irrespective of what people think. Because the Bible has proven itself to be true. It is. The testimony to it is true. But once you have done that investigative work and your faith, you're able to put your faith totally on it and stand on it, then out is going to come the production of an obedience that is unlike anything else. The greatest testimonies to true, proper obedience are the ones that are most deeply rooted in faith. Imagine what would happen if every person in here was so grounded in a faith in the gospel. If God says it, I believe it. In that hour of temptation when the brain, the flesh, the mind, the impulses are saying, "Did I really believe that? Really?" If you don't really believe it, you're not going to do what God says in that hour. But if your faith is in Jesus, then it doesn't matter how strong the impulse to disobey is. You will know in that hour, I believe Jesus. Therefore, my decision is made. Jesus said, do it my way and you'll be blessed. Do it my way, it'll be better for you. Do it my way, you'll be happier. Do it my way, you'll have eternal life. Do it my way, you'll even prosper here in this life, for the most part, generally speaking. I believe that. So I'm going to do it God's way. And I think that's what was happening here at the Roman church. That's why Paul is saying your obedience is known everywhere. Your faith is known everywhere. So I thank God for it. That's the first part of the message. Second part is getting at, and it might seem to be somewhat unrelated, but I don't think that it is. What is the substance of a mission that would be divinely authorized? Now, I want to say this, and I want to speak a little bit to this, because right now we are involved in missions monetarily. We are funding certain missions, and I hope, and it is my intentions here, that at some point in the future, and I hope God puts it on your heart right now to be a part of this when it does happen, that we would send some people out into the mission field, either long-term or some kind of temporary missions. But prior to doing so, you can't just say, we're going to go do missions. You have to have a biblical grasp on what is a mission God would authorize. What is the substance of a mission to which God would say, that indeed is a mission that is in line with the gospel. That indeed is a mission that I can call missions. That's what I want to kind of get at here. Go back to chapter 1, and we're between verses 8 and 15, so we're gonna stay there for the rest of the time, or for most of the rest of the time. First of all, I think I asked last week, why does Paul want to get to Rome? Well, that's kind of the main point in verses 8 through 15, is Paul wants to get to Rome. In verse 10, he says, asking that somehow by God's will I may now at last succeed in coming to you. Verse 11, for I long to see you. Verse 13, I want you to know, brothers, that I've often intended to come to you. So, it's 3 different ways Paul's saying, I want to get to Rome. That's my intentions. That's my goal. That's the direction. And the question is, what does Paul want to do when he gets to Rome? Is he working with TripAdvisor to go get a tour of the Colosseum? Does he want to go see the palace of Caesar? Does he want to go see the amazing architecture that was unprecedented in the ancient world in Rome? Viewing their incredible aqueduct system? Does he want to go paint a tiki hut? What's he say he wants to do? Want to go there. Now, there are 2 main things he says, this is what I'm doing, and here's why I want to come. Verse 11, I long to see you so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to strengthen you. It's my intention. I want to come make you stronger. That is, that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. So what's the spiritual gift he wants to impart? It's the spiritual gift of encouragement, which, a brief little side note, that may be your spiritual gift. And I know there are many in this audience that have that as their spiritual gift. Do not doubt the power of that. When your gift is encouragement, I can only speak for myself because I don't know what it feels like to be another person and them personally getting encouraged. I only know what it feels like for me to be encouraged. But when I receive texts of encouragement and cards of encouragement and words of encouragement, it just keeps me going. That's how the church works. So that's what he wants to do. I want to come. I want to make you stronger. So I'm going to encourage you. And you'll do the same thing to me. That's the way he's the preacher, but he's going to say, you're going to encourage me at the same time. When you encourage me, it makes me stronger to continue being an encouragement to you by preaching and service and whatever else is involved in it. So that's the first thing he says that he wants to do. And then he says in verse 13, I've often intended to come to you in order that I may reap some harvest among you. Which that harkens back to Matthew chapter 9, when Jesus was getting ready to send the 70 disciples out into the harvest. He said, the harvest is plentiful, but there are so few workers. There's so many, there is always, remember this, there are always more people in need of the gospel and ready to be harvested were the farmer to merely come along, then there are people willing to go be involved in doing it. Always. Can never overemphasize becoming a preacher, becoming a missionary, or dedicating your life in some way to being involved in collecting this harvest for the coming of Jesus. So that's what he says. That's what I want to do. I want to come and strengthen you, and I want to come save souls. Those 2 things collectively identify the sum total and substance of what a divinely authorized mission is. So as we look forward, and I'm glad right now we're not doing any missions, but as we look forward to doing missions, we need to come back to the drawing board and ask, is the intention primarily, fundamentally, that we're going to go and strengthen some Christians that are already there, and that's our main purpose? Or we're going to go and we're going to save souls, and that's our main purpose? Or it's going to somehow be a collection of the 2? That is missions. Going to paint a building in another country that the people there could paint very easily themselves, and then spending 4 days buying souvenirs is not missions. It is not a mission trip. So that needs to be established right now, but Paul is saying, so this is what the purpose is. And now it doesn't mean that you're not going to ever paint a building when you go do it. You may. But if that's the main purpose of going, that's not missions. It needs to be, I'm going to go strengthen those Christians because they're, I think about Colin and Gugu. I think about them, and they may need that. Somebody from here to say, we're going to come, and that's going to be what we're going to do. We're going to come and strengthen you because you guys are over there by yourself. We don't see the days in and days outs of the struggle that they're facing there in South Africa. They are over there by themselves. They may very well need their supporting congregation to go. So I'm just putting that out there as a seed for the future. And they may need some assistance in harvesting souls for Christ. Now, lastly, how do you accomplish what Paul is saying his main purposes are, which are strengthen and collect a harvest or save souls? How do you accomplish those two things? Well, Paul tells it very clearly. 3 ways. Number 1, pray. Which, by the way, is something the world really needs right now. More prayer. A prayer is a lot more powerful than a protest. Always. A prayer is always first and chief and the strongest. Because you're petitioning the one who has actual solidified say-so over the entire universe. And you're going before him. And I get this because this is what Paul said in verses 9 and 10. I thank my God for you, Christians, who have never even met before. I thank God for you. And God is my witness that without ceasing, I mention you always in my prayers. That speaks right to the heart of the kind of person who's going to be sent out into the missions. Somebody who, even without knowing them and without ceasing, is bringing them before the throne of God in prayer. That tells me that if they go to do missions, then their purpose is more than wanderlust. Our excitement to see another part of the world, their purpose is these Christians. Pray for them. Paul was praying for them. What do you think that did for the church there? To have the prayers of a man like Paul backing it. Number 2, how do you accomplish strengthening and saving? Prayers was number 1. The second thing is that the desire to strengthen and the will to save are both thoroughly accomplished through the preaching of the gospel. And I say that because after stating all of his intentions here in these verses, Paul said, so I am eager to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome. I want to come strengthen you. I want to come save souls among you. And then, therefore, I'm going to come preach the gospel. How do you get somebody stronger in their faith? Give them the good news of the gospel. That doesn't mean that you just talk to them about the death, burial, and resurrection and the facts surrounding it, but give them the whole truth of the gospel. The world right now, by the way, needs this so bad. They need it so absolutely, and they are longing for it. Right now is the time to strike. People need the gospel. People are scared. People are living in fear. People are totally uncertain about the future. People's hopes and trusts in government are shattered, which means they're looking for somebody else, some other kind of leadership. And by the way, right now, Black Lives Matter is 62% of our country is in support of Black Lives Matter right now. The activist group, not the concept, the activist group, 62%, which is a number that is far greater than either Joe Biden or President Trump in terms of the amount of support they have. Now, I wrote something recently about the concept of Black Lives Matter being a concept that is as biblical through and through and through and through and through. Black lives do matter. So do Indian lives. So do unborn lives. Every life in the world matters because all of us share one blood made in the image of God. All of us. That's a true statement. But the organization itself is one that has insidious purposes underneath it to disrupt the nuclear family, to impose transgenderism over society, and to do a number of other things along with it. Now, I don't think that everybody that's in support of the activist group knows those underlying things, but the thing that strikes me is that there's 62% of the world who has been disillusioned by the politics on both left and right, that they're saying we need something that at least has some kind of substance. Now, I don't agree with the activist group, but the thing that's striking is that right now people are longing for something of substance. I want to do something with my life that means something for somebody else's life, because I've lived too long as an American doing nothing but playing video games and doing things for me, and I realized that doesn't make me happy. So I at least want to be part of something that's about bringing justice and goodness to somebody else. I think that's what's happening. Now, ultimately, that's going to be in vain because it's the justice of man and it lacks the proverbs of God. But that tells me that people are longing for something. So you need to be ready to give the gospel as it is, the good news of Jesus, the only power to save, the only power to break down the dividing wall of hostility that exists between people groups, Jews, Gentiles, blacks, whites. Which, by the way, blacks and whites are Gentiles. And by the way, God never anywhere in the Bible classifies people by race, ever. He says, from one man came all the world. From one man. So we're all brothers. The idea of race isn't there. The only distinction that the Bible makes are people in covenant with God and people out of covenant with God. That's it. The Jews were the people of God, and by the way, they would have had some varied tones of skin color. Read Song of Solomon and one of his wives he's singing to. She said, my body's been kissed by the sun. So God does not create that distinction, and we should not continue to make that the main basis of our differences, because it is not. Christ broke that down, but people are longing for the truth, and the gospel is the way that we're going to save. Paul says, I want to do this, so I'm going to come and I'm going to preach the gospel. That's what we've got to give. Give the gospel right now. And lastly, how this is accomplished is keeping in mind this principle that the mission of God is not always a clear-cut path. It is not always something that just falls right into place. It's not something that just, as maybe Pentecostalism would have us believe, is something that just is laid out before you and all of a sudden it's like, oh, God just opened all these doors. This must be exactly the way that he wants me to go. It doesn't always work that way. And here's why. When you're considering the gospel and the mission of God to save souls and your part in it, do not be hindered because there are obstacles and doors that seem to close and difficulties along the way. Because we're very often quick to say things like, I don't think God wants me to be involved in this because of X, Y, and Z. If the mission at hand is the saving of souls, God wants you to do it. And we cannot let anything back us off from that. And the reason why I get this is because, do you know, when Paul wrote Romans 15, do you know that when he said, I want to come to Rome, I'm coming to Rome. Do you know the difficulties from the point when he said that to the point when he arrived on their shores? Do you have any idea what happened between that statement and when he actually got there? Well, the answer is Acts chapter 19 all the way through Acts chapter 28. I want to show you something and then we'll be done. Go over to Romans 15. 25 through 29, Paul had just said, we read earlier, verses 20 through 24, where he said, I've made it my aim not to preach the gospel where it's already been proclaimed, so I don't lay a foundation on top of somebody else's. So that's why I've not come to you yet. But he says, so I'm going to come to you. But then he says in verse 25, at present, Romans 15:25, at present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem, bringing aid to the saints. So right now, he says, I'm taking a gift to the saints because Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. Which, by the way, if you've read 1 Corinthians, when Paul says, lay up your gift on the first day of every week so that when I come, I don't have to do any collecting, so that it's ready for me. This is that gift that he's talking about, that he's going to go collect there from Greece. Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem, for they were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. Because if the Gentiles have come to share in the spiritual blessings, they ought also to be of service to them in material blessings. When therefore I have completed this and have delivered to them what has been collected, I will leave for Spain by way of you. I know that when I come to you, I will come in the fullness of Christ. Now go over to Acts chapter 19 and verse 21. It says, now after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and then go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. So Acts chapter 19 is picking up where Romans chapter 15 leaves off. Paul says, I just went to Achaia and Macedonia. Now I'm going to Jerusalem. Then I'm going to Rome. Acts 19 says, after these events, Paul said, I'm going to Macedonia and Achaia, which if you put a period after Achaia, that's where Romans 15 picks up. And then go to Jerusalem, saying, I've been there. So after Achaia, Paul says, I'm then going to Jerusalem, and then I'm headed your way. That was his plan. I want to come there. Just got finished in these two places. They've given me the gift. I'm bringing it to the Jews, and then I'm coming your way. Now I want to give you a very brief paragraph synopsis of what happened between Acts 19 and Acts 28. This was Paul's journey to go accomplish the will of God. Paul departed from Ephesus to Greece, where he'd pick up the gift from Macedonia and Achaia, which we already talked about. He spent 3 months in Greece, after which a plot became known to him against his life, so he left for Philippi. Was there, then he went to Assos, then to Mytilene, then Samos, then Miletus, hastening to bring the gift to Jerusalem. On his way, he stopped in Ephesus. He called together all of the elders and all the Christians from the church that he had worked with previously on one of his missionary journeys for 2 years there in Ephesus. And he laid everything out to them, and he said, knowing somehow in his spirit, I'm never going to see you again. You're never in this life going to ever see my face again. It says that the Christians there wept and embraced Paul and sent him off. Then he went to Kos, then Rhodes, then Patara. Then he boarded a ship to Syria, landed at Tyre, met with the Christians there, was warned by the Christians, if you go to Jerusalem, you are going to be bound and imprisoned. Paul said, why are you breaking my heart? Don't you know I'm not only ready to be bound for Christ, I'm ready to give my life for Christ, because that's where Paul was. He was a slave of Christ. If Christ wants me to go, I'm going to go do it. The gospel is everything. I have one life, and it's about this. What does it matter what happens in this blip of time when I have an eternity in front of me? During this time between here and then, I'm going to obey Christ. I'll do anything that he wants. So don't break my heart this way. So he left from Ephesus, went to Jerusalem. He was bound when he got there for preaching the gospel. Then they took him out and beat him. In the middle of beating him, he asked the tribune if he could speak to the people. Tribune let him go out and preach the gospel, and he did. And then after he did it, they took him and they beat him again. Then he went back into prison. While he was in prison, he got word that they were trying to kill him, and they had a plan hatched to do so. Word came to Felix from a young man who somehow heard this through a series of events, came to the tribune. The tribune, knowing that Paul was a Roman citizen and had every right to be on a fair trial and not just killed this way, he made word to Felix, and Paul went there, escaping that death. And then through a lengthy series of events, which there are a lot more details involved along the way, Paul finally made it to Rome after, along the way, being shipwrecked. Do you think there was a point in the mind of Paul where he thought, I don't think God wants me to go to Rome? I don't think so. I think Paul remembered back to Acts chapter 9 and verse 16 when God, when he first called Paul, said, I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. And Paul kept that dear and close to him. The gospel is everything. It is worth everything. And the faiths that have the greatest obediences that are going to be known everywhere in the world are the ones that buy into that fact. Let's bear Christ. Let's bear the gospel before the world. Right now they need it more than ever.